Hi everyone, in this video of Accelerated Chess Dragon, we're going to be looking at a chess endgame, and this is about the square of the pawn. Now, what exactly is the square of the pawn? The square of the pawn is an imaginary square that you can actually draw, in which you can calculate whether or not your enemy's king can stop your pawn, or whether you can stop your enemy's pawn, depending on which side you're playing. In this case, we can see that white is actually up one pawn, but it depends on whose move it is. If it's white to move, then it's going to be a win for white. If it's black to move, black can hold the position. Let's draw the square of the pawn to see how this works. So basically the way to draw the square of the pawn is to basically draw a diagonal line that connects the pawn to the rank that it's going to be queening on. If it's white, then it's going to be the 8th rank, and for black, it's going to be the 1st rank. So we draw this, and then we simply draw this so that it goes to the same rank as the pawn, and then we simply complete the square like this. And we can actually get rid of the diagonal. And what do we notice from this square? Well, we notice that it is a 6 by 6. So the king needs to be within one of these 36 squares to actually be able to stop the pawn from queening. Or he needs to be able to enter one of those 36 squares so he can stop the pawn from queening. And if you look at this specific case, the king can enter the square in two different moves. And what are those two moves? Well, they are king to g4 and king to g3. If the king enters into either one of these squares, then black can stop the pawn. But if black plays something like king to h4, then white will push b4. And now if we yet again draw the square, we notice that black cannot enter it on the next move, meaning that black is not able to stop the pawn. So white will queen and easily win. So you shouldn't go king h4, you should instead go either king g3 or king g4, preferably king g3 to limit the movement of white's king. And after b4, let's say that white continues to try pushing the pawn and tries to queen, black manages to get there just in the nick of time and can stop the pawn from queening, and it'll be insufficient material. Same thing works if you go king to g4. Even if white tries to use the king to help, you are still able to stop the pawn. Let's say king g2, just go king f4, and yeah, after all of this, you can go king c5, and it's fine if white tries to approach you like this, because after king b5, white cannot make any progress as his king is on the same rank as the pawn. So after this, you can see that black manages to get a draw. King h4, on the other hand, would allow b4, and then white can obviously win, but that is only a slight possibility, assuming that black doesn't understand the square of the pawn. However, if it was actually white to move, so if we decide to make it white to move, then the position is slightly different. Since when it's white to move, white is actually going to be the one moving. So b4 makes sense, right? Because you're trying to advance your pawn. And now if we draw the square, we notice that black cannot enter it on the next move, or is not in it at the current moment. So black cannot stop this pawn from queening, meaning that white is essentially going to win this game. And if you remembered from my floating square video, then you probably remember the technique being used very often, just to calculate whether you can stop both of those pawns from queening or not. So in this case, it depends on whose move it is and what move they play. If it's white to move and white goes b4, then black is simply done for. If it's black to move and black goes king g3 or king g4, black can stop the pawn from queening and gets a draw. So let's look at two more positions. In this second puzzle, we tried to examine the square of the pawn again. And if you remember from my floating square video, I basically said that if the pawn is going to be on the second rank, then you basically have to count it as if it was on a3, because the pawn has the option of moving two squares on the first move. So, if the pawn is on a3 and we calculate the square of the pawn, we notice that black is in it and is essentially able to stop the pawn from queening. But Black has to go king e4, king d5, and then bring the king out this way, and only then be able to stop the pawn from queening. So with that factor taken into mind, how are we going to be able to prevent black from stopping our pawn from queening? What we must do is we must play the move d5. We block the king's path to simply go to e4, and then to d5, and then to c6 and guard the pawn. So, with this d5 move, black has two choices. You can either take the pawn, or you could ignore it. If you ignore the pawn and go for something like king to e3, then white will just push the pawn. Don't take the pawn on e6, just push it. And now after something like e5, d7, e4, d8 queen. White easily promotes, black has nothing here. So king e3 is obviously ruled out. So what happens if you play e takes d5? Well, if you go e takes d5, then now you block your path to essentially stop the pawn from queening. So now white goes a4, black plays king e4 now, and now white goes a5. And black has no way of actually stopping the pawn from reaching the a8 square. So black is lost here. If you were going to try the move d4, which tries to simply get some counterplay against the pawn, after a5, d3, you shouldn't be too excited that you're advancing the pawn all the way to get a queen. Because here, this is a mistake that many people make. They think that their pawn is just going to queen, so they don't want to do anything else. They don't want to take care of any other threats. But in this specific case, if you don't do that, you're actually going to lose the game. Because if you play a6, then d2, and all of a sudden it went from white winning to black winning. Because white has no way of stopping this pawn from queening, as the e1 square is guarded by the pawn, and the e2 square, which is the only other square that can actually guard the pawn from queening, that the king can access, is guarded by the king as well. So now, if you push, then d1 queen, or even d1 rook, both of those moves are checkmate. And if you try to run away, instead of going a7, you go king g1, then d1 queen. King goes to h2, and you have no fear, you go queen to f1. It's going to be made on the next move after a7, queen g2. This is checkmate. So you don't just push the pawn. You have to realize that maybe black has something, and you should instead guard the d2 square so that black has no counter chances. After king e1, now black is completely lost, because if you try king e3, a6, d2, white can simply occupy the square this pawn is going to use to queen. And this pawn on f7 isn't fast enough. And essentially, once this position occurs, we can already tell that it's white who's winning after something like queen to d5. The pawn is going to fall, and black has essentially nothing. So, after this d5 move, black is completely lost. So it's important to maybe shut the king's path to stop the pawn in order to queen your own pawn. And doing that, you might have to sacrifice some material, but the end result can be completely worth it. Let's look at our final position. In this final example that we're going to be looking at of the square of the pawn, we notice that white is down a pawn. They have two doubled pawns against black having a c pawn, a g pawn, and an h pawn. Now, you might obviously be thinking at first that this position could either be a draw or maybe black has a slight chance of winning. But in fact, that's actually the opposite of what the result is really supposed to be. In fact, the result is actually a win for white. And how are you going to produce a win? Well, you take advantage of the fact that this king cannot infiltrate to b7 or to b6 to guard this pawn from trying to queen. And you also want to make sure that these pawns cannot advance. This g pawn and this h pawn. So what are you going to do here if you are white? You're going to go king to h3. It's a very nice way of creating zugzwang for black. Now, if black obviously does not want to lose immediately, they can try sacrificing a couple of pawns with g4, king takes g4, or king takes h4, and h3, king takes h3. But after all is said and done, this king has to move away. And once it moves away from the square of the pawn, because now we notice that it is like this is the square of the pawn that we're examining. Because now once the king moves away, you go a7. And now this is the square, essentially. The king is not able to reach that square, and essentially this means that white is winning. So I hope this video clarified the topic of the square of the pawn a bit more. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please let me know in the comment section, and stay tuned for more chess.